Hello, guys. I'm Maddie, and this is my presentation on the investigation of Al Capone. So, there was actually supposed to be a cool video that I played at the beginning. It completely cut out. It is not working, and I can't exit to show you this. So, I will do the best to catch up I can. We should start probably with who is he? I'm sure we've all heard of Al Capone. We are living in Chicago. It's his home base in a sense, but he was born in 1899 to Italian immigrant parents. He did not excel at school. This is something I'm sure surprises absolutely nobody. He was expelled at the age of 14 from school because he hit a female teacher in the face. So already we can see some signs of early violence. Before I go any further, I should say Capone is not a good man. Again, I'm sure this doesn't surprise anybody. He's suspected of doing a lot of really terrible things. But it's 1920s and it's the mob, and as we'll learn, actually a lot of people grew to like him in the city. But again, this next bullet point here, he's starting off early, so he actually joins the Five Points gang in New York. This is at the recommendation of Johnny Torrio, who we will be hearing a lot about. Torrio is very involved in the gang scene originally in New York, and then he's actually the one that extends the invitation to Capone to come to Chicago. So Capone is not in Chicago right away. He gets his roots in New York. Torrio is the head of the crime syndicate at the time in Chicago. Obviously, they no longer exist. This is a mob called the Colosimo mob. Capone marries May, his wife, before they leave for Chicago, and then they have a son. My picture's sort of in the way, but I will do the best I can to catch you up. Their son is Albert. His nickname is Sonny. We're going to get a lot of gang nicknames in here, so bear it how you will. And then Torrio actually, there was an assassination attempt on him in 1925. He survived, so he decided to go into retirement. He didn't want to deal with it anymore, so he hands control of the mob over to Capone. Capone is 26 at the time, so he is very young. And then this is not something that is, easily proven, but there were a lot of psychological workups done after Capone had been released from prison, which again is something we'll go into more later. But I thought it was important to include. I always think, there's a reason criminals are criminals. But obviously, as I already touched on, he was not very good at school. He had a series of developmental disorders, as we can see below here, after he was released from prison. He had a psychological workup done by 2 doctors, and they determined they had the mind of a 12-year-old. We'll touch on that more later near the end of the presentation. But I thought it was important to include. He is not the brightest of individuals when it doesn't concern crime, but he was a very good criminal, which is not a shining achievement. His father died when he was 21, so he was very young, and this left him with a sense of abandonment. His father was the man of the house, and certainly somebody he looked up to, and this is something that Capone will go on to embody in his own family and life. But this then leaves an impressionable and vulnerable Al in the hands of Johnny Torrio, who, as we've already established, is also not the finest of gentlemen. This is not to make excuses for his terrible behavior. I just think it was important to include that certainly soon thereafter, when his father dies, he allows this kind of gang figure to become his father figure, which certainly shapes a lot of who Al turns out to be. He is very attached to his mother, his wife, his family in general. Some of his grandkids, and I think at this point great-grandkids, are still alive, and they all wrote a book saying that he was very actively involved in their family life. He would call all of them every night to let them know what he was doing. Obviously, not the intricacies. When he was finally arrested, a lot of his family didn't know the full extent of what he was doing. Obviously, they knew he was involved in the mob. I mean, that was pretty hard to miss. They knew that he was a bootlegger, that he probably was a criminal. They didn't know that he was involved in such a violent crime. And then he believed in a separation of work and home life. This is a dissociation tactic he learned from Torrio, who taught him to separate business from pleasure. It's also a defense tactic, right? So when he is, arrested, his family can't come down with him because they don't know much. I'm also not going to spend a whole lot of time on this one. I want to get to some of the investigation techniques, but I thought it was important to include. So we're going to talk later. He gets convicted for tax evasion, but obviously the federal government knew he was doing a lot more than meets the eye. What's hard is that he doesn't like to get his hands dirty. We've kind of already touched on that. But he's suspected of doing a lot. He is brought in under assumptions that he's violating the Volstead Act, which is prohibition, which leads us to our first point here. He's a big bootlegger. This is what gives him power and money. This is basically what the mob does to earn an income, to gain notoriety, stuff like that. Bootlegging is basically the sale of alcohol. Again, let's remember we're in the time of prohibition. People want their booze still. It's, a form of entertainment. So this is what Capone does for a living. He's also suspected of murder, but basically an accomplice to murder. He's never actually the one who pulls the trigger. I'm fairly certain he did in his time in New York, but certainly when he becomes the mob boss, he's not actually the one committing the murder. So that's why I put accomplice to murder, co-conspirator to murder. They're not able to get him on any of this. Again, doesn't like to get his hands dirty. But then here we have tax evasion, which I put in bold. It's kind of important. This case that happens, it alters the trajectory of his life for sure. So on May 16th, 1927, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in U.S. versus Sullivan that gains from illicit traffic in liquor are subject to the income tax that would be taxable. What's important to note here is Capone never filed a federal tax return because he claims if it's illegal, you can't tax it. It's illegal money. That's mine. And basically this court ruling states it is taxable, even if it's illegal. Eventually he goes down for it. So I thought it was important to include gambling, still illegal in Illinois, racketeering, which is basically fraudulent business dealings. Again, he's doing a lot more than meets the eye. He's got dog racetracks and banks and hotels and gambling sites all over in Cicero. So, 7 miles away from here. Prostitution, acting as a pimp, bribery, robbery, narcotics trafficking, because it's not all booze. And then what he gets arrested for qualifies him for white-collar crime, especially if he's, dealing in fraudulent business dealings. So, the textbook would state that white-collar crime, also called economic or corporate crime, involves illegal, prohibited, and demonstrably harmful acts characterized by fraud, concealment, or a violation of private or public trust. So Al Capone is a white-collar criminal, even though he kind of dallies in both fields of crime. And then this is a quote I thought was very interesting. It details the corruption in Chicago in the 1920s. Obviously, we know corruption is a part of everyday life, unfortunately, but certainly in Chicago in the 1920s, it was a huge deal. It's what allowed Capone to run rampant for many years. So it reads, layers of embedded and multiplex relationships between criminals and non-criminals comprised Chicago's Prohibition-era organized crime network. So, without bribing every politician in the area, I'm not sure Capone's Prohibition network would have become as big as it turned out to be. And then, of course, this talks about the fear factor that was involved. I'm going to read it and then explain a bit more, but it reads, the implication was clear that politicians and government officials were controlled by criminals, not vice versa. Citizens were frightened and made sensitive to the potential for destruction that the alleged mafia posed. This is really touches on a lot of things that are important. As I mentioned, bribery. He had everybody in Chicago kind of on his payroll, which allowed him to run rampant, as we've already stated. It does read that citizens were frightened, and I'm going to touch next on the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. And they were frightened once they learned the true extent of Capone's crimes. He's a violent criminal. He's doing terrible things, seemingly with no consequence whatsoever. What's also important to note is that before this massacre that makes headlines everywhere, people loved him. People really loved him. He was a celebrity. Eventually, he goes on to be on the cover of Time magazine twice, which is something I'll talk about more. But they really did admire him for sure. He's providing them booze, and nobody else is. So he's breaking this, this law that's, very unpopular, and he's doing it very well. So when he would go to Cubs games, he would actually get, round of applause, standing ovation. People liked him that much. He would go on to burn his reputation, but that's, topic for another conversation. Which leads me to the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. I'm not sure if you knew anything about it. I didn't before I started this presentation and this work in researching Mr. Capone. I'm going to include it because it's only about a block away from Oz Park, so it's very close to our campus. You can go see the brick garage wall, where these individuals were murdered. It's in the Mob Museum in Las Vegas, which is actually a good site for a lot of information. I'm not really going to talk that much about it. Obviously, it happened on February 14th. So it's important to include because it's regarded as a culmination of violence in the Chicago gang area. So basically, when Capone is in power, there's also another gang on the north side, right? So George Bugs Moran, sorry about the nickname, I hate it too. George was in control of the north side and Capone ran the south side. His base was in Cicero, as I've already mentioned. And this was a play for more control over Chicago's bootleg territory. That's what they're fighting about. So basically what happens is a couple of Capone's men go dressed up as police officers. They round up 7 guys of, Moran's gang, and then they act like they're going to arrest them only to kill them. And this made headlines pretty much everywhere. It's what burned his reputation because now they know that Capone is in charge of running, a murderous operation of sorts. It's what gives him notoriety, but more importantly, infamy. So he went from being somebody that people kind of regarded as a sort of Robin Hood figure to somebody who is now a very violent criminal. But of course, let's remember, Capone was in Florida. That's where his home was, his vacation home of sorts. He's in Florida a lot. He is not around when a lot of these things happen because he doesn't want to be. He doesn't want to get his hands dirty. Let's remember that. That's why it's so hard for authorities to bring him down. So then before we get into the tax evasion case, I figured we'd take some time to talk about the agencies that investigated him. There are a lot of moving parts here, a lot of figures. I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide. What is the FBI? I'm sure our professor could tell you, but as we already know, they're the Federal Bureau of Investigations, but they were called the Bureau of Investigation up until 1935. They do counterintelligence, terrorism, hate crimes, white-collar crimes, civil rights violations, cybercrime, organized crime, and a slew of other things. Up on top there, we have, not its founder, but its most famous figure, J. Edgar Hoover. We all know a lot about him. I'm not going to take time to explain that. But then the IRS. So this is actually highly regarded as the most important organization in the Capone investigation. So the IRS is the Internal Revenue Service. When you file your taxes, this is where it's going. They do have an enforcement section. I like to call them the math police. Basically, they can see if you are filing income tax, federal tax. They want to see where your money's coming from. They want to see if it's illegal money, if it's counterfeit money, and they can trace all that. And they traced it back to Al Capone. That's why I call them the math police. So up on top, we have Special Agent Elliot Ness. If you've ever seen the movie The Untouchables, he is the main character. He is a American Prohibition and IRS agent. So he was actually sent to Chicago to get Capone on violations of the Volstead Act, not tax evasion. Clearly this doesn't work, but he's very involved in the investigation, and he is kind of the ball that gets things rolling. So let's remember him. He's kind of an American hero, cult classic legend in a sense. But yeah, Elliot Ness. And then George Johnson and Frank Wilson. So George Johnson is the prosecutor for the tax evasion case. He's a U.S. attorney. He actually offered Al Capone a plea deal, but the judge in this case rejected it. So they had already agreed to the deal. Al Capone was going to plead guilty and get less time and, go about his merry life. But Judge Wilkerson said no. He was like, if we take this, the federal court system is going to look weak, fraudulent. I don't know what to make of that. Kind of Capone had his way with every agency in the land, so maybe it was a bit late for that, but they do reject the plea deal. And then we have Frank Wilson, who we're going to be hearing a lot about. He, Elliot Ness gets all the glory, but Frank Wilson is the one that brought Capone to justice. So he is the lead forensic accountant and treasury agent, and he's the one who gathered evidence for the tax evasion angle. So the whole time Elliot Ness is trying to get him for prohibition, our man, Special Agent Frank Wilson, is working on tax evasion because he found out that, Capone never filed a federal income tax report. So the FBI gets involved. Again, I'm going to make this really quick. What's important to note about this slide is that the FBI cannot get involved for a number of years. A lot of Capone's crimes just happened in Chicago, you know, murder, maiming, bribery, whatever. They're not good, but they're state crimes, not federal crimes. And the FBI in its early period was more limited than it is now. And prohibition actually fell to the Bureau of Prohibition, which no longer exists. We don't have prohibition. But what happens basically is that Capone gets subpoenaed in Florida for a case relating to violations of the Volstead Act. He claims he can't be there. He's sick. I can't make it. Please wait for me, whatever. The FBI gets a tip that Capone is lying. He's a pathological liar, so they think they have pretty good information as it is. So they send agents to Florida, and they can do that now because his crimes have crossed state lines. They surveil him. They see that he is out and about at dog racing tracks, and people are willing to admit to his good health. So they let him go back to Chicago and do his testimony there, and then they cite him for contempt of court. He is released on bond. He has a lot of money. He can do that. Then he goes to Philadelphia, where he is then arrested for carrying a concealed weapon, and they arrest him again and put him in jail for a year. Basically, all of this is leading up to they're trying to buy time to work this tax evasion angle. So it's contempt of court, then carrying a concealed weapon, and then they're like, okay, we're moving forward with this case. They bring him back to Chicago, and they try him for tax evasion. He had $215,000 in back taxes, and if I move my picture, you would see that today that is the equivalent of $4.2 million in back taxes. Obviously, the rest of the story is he gets arrested. He gets 11 years in prison. The contempt of court charge is to be served concurrently. He spends his days at Alcatraz. I will go into more detail about that later. And then this is a important quote I thought to include. So we're going to talk about proxy crime. And basically, they wanted to get Capone for, murder, bribery, racketeering, whatever the case is, prohibition. They got him for tax evasion. That's a proxy crime is basically, we just got to get this guy in prison. So it raised this method, substitute proxy crime, was afterwards implemented in the U.S. on several conditions, with Capone and Jake Gusick being first, and Aldrich Ames being a recent case in the 1990s. So Jake Gusick is actually Capone's right-hand man. His nickname is Greasy Thumb. I don't like it, but it is what it is. And then Aldrich Ames is, he worked for the U.S. government. It's kind of an interesting case, but I won't spend too much time on it. He went on to obtain charges of espionage and treason, but they also got him for tax evasion. So basically, that is just charging you with a crime so you can go to jail so we can get you for your actual crimes later. So let's talk about some investigative techniques. So technique number one is they got an informant, which was very important. A lot of people weren't too keen on the idea of testifying against Capone. He's a very dangerous man. And basically, if you testified against him, the idea was you'd be dead. Which is, it's a somber thought, as it were. So Eddie O'Hare was Capone's lawyer, and he ran a dog racing track in Cicero. And O'Hare is a very morally ambiguous character, so he wants to do what's best for him, and he's about to marry a politician's daughter, so he wants to keep his image squeaky clean. The challenge is investigators needed to convince him to testify, and O'Hare wanted to know what was in it for him and if it was worth it. I mean, he might be dead for all we know. The success was the feds did their research and they found that O'Hare owed money to them as well. So basically, everybody involved in this case doesn't want to pay their taxes, so they threaten him with jail time. Either testify or we're going to charge you too. Obviously, O'Hare does. And then they surveilled him. Obviously, I've talked about this. He was in Florida. He said he couldn't be there. That was a lie. We all knew it. So they sent people to surveil him. They saw him out and about. They needed to find people, and this was the challenging part, they needed to find people who were willing to admit to his good health and who were not bought out. So if you're not going to end up dead, you probably have accepted money from Capone and his gang. And they also needed to not be caught. We're talking about Capone, who's a very dangerous man. The success was they had the element of surprise. So they gather all of this evidence from surveillance. And then they allow him to go to Chicago to testify, where they then basically wait outside the courthouse to arrest him for contempt of court, right? He gets out, He goes to Philadelphia. He gets arrested. They're there right away. But they have the element of surprise the whole time. Capone doesn't expect them to be there or to be keeping up with him. So that worked very well. Technique number 3, arguably the most important, was forensic accounting. So he's a very smart criminal, Al Capone. He liked to cover his tracks, bribed anyone who could point a finger at him. This we already know. The problem was Capone flaunted his wealth. I mean, he had only the finest of suits. He bought out a hotel to stay in. He would buy his associates really nice watches and things of that manner. We're talking $20,000 watches a pop for many different people. So Wilson knew he had money, so he stayed vigilant. They just didn't know where it was coming from. But he eventually, in a raid in 1926, I believe, he found Capone's ledger. It was obviously written in code. They're not going to say, like, George sent Al Capone money for whatever. But they were able to match the handwriting back to a bank deposit slip to one of Capone's banks in Cicero. So this is how they knew he had money he wasn't reporting. And then evidence obtained. So Wilson, the prosecutor in the case, got witnesses on the stand. This is anybody, contractors, butchers, jewelers, brokers, etc., to prove that Capone had made profits. Most importantly, Leslie Shumway. He was one of the individuals. He is the guy who signed Capone's bank deposit slips. So what I talked about in the last slide, the slips turned up at one of Capone's banks in Cicero, and then Shumway testified to the nature of his business dealings and stated that I took orders relating to the business from Mr. Alphonse Capone. So this proves facts of the case, stating basically meaning Capone has money and we're doing business dealings, and it is admissible. So that was very important. Step number 2, they did an interrogation. This is before they decided to bring charges against Capone. Basically, they were at his Florida home. Wilson pressed him. It was Wilson, Capone, and a number of lawyers. Wilson sort of got answers out of Capone, but not really. His answers were very evasive. His questions were, where are you getting all this stuff? Where's your money coming from? Show us you have income. Capone really couldn't give a good answer, and they decided based on this that they had a good enough case to bring against him, because if he can't, tell us where his money is coming from, that probably means it's illegal. So it is admissible and very material. He made admissions about his income, whether they helped him or not. And then finally, evidence exhibit number 3, documents. So as I stated, the first big break came in the summer of 1930. So actually the raid was in 1926, but it took them a number of years to go back to find this ledger. It included references to Al. So we know he's making income, and we know his mob is making income as well, the leader of the syndicate. He weeded out income. This is Wilson we're talking about, the forensic accountant, lead investigator of sorts. So I actually thought this was really interesting to include. The ledger was actually inadmissible because the statute of limitations had run out. Capone's lawyers didn't know this, so they allowed it into evidence. It was actually evidence exhibit A, which tells you something about Capone's lawyers. They didn't need to put it in the court case. It probably would have helped him, but they did. They didn't know that the statute of limitations had run out, so that's very interesting to me, kind of ironic in a sense. And then case critique. So the reliability of eyewitness testimony is a huge thing here. Everybody is fearful of him because they know what he can do. Like I said, if you haven't been bribed, you're probably going to end up dead. A lot of, the prosecution's witnesses flipped on the stand. So in one case, Reese is testifying for the prosecution. He basically said Al's brother Ralph, they're working at a gambling club, whatever. Gusick, who we've already mentioned, told him not to hand cash over to anybody besides himself or the man he would send for, not Al. This proves that Al knows about the money, he's just not taking it. But then the defense got him to admit that he never saw Capone take any of the cash, which flies right in the face of the prosecution's case. Capone also bribed members of the jury pool. He bribed all of the jury pool. And Wilson found out about this, told Judge Wilkerson, and Judge Wilkerson had to swap the juries midway through the trial. So we've got a lot of things going on that make this sort of not reliable. In fact, I'm pretty sure today they would qualify this as a mistrial, but I guess it worked out for the prosecution. And then the role of the media. So as I stated, Capone was something of a celebrity, or at least he wanted to be. He talked to reporters a lot about, I'm not doing anything wrong. I'm just giving the people what they want. Of course, he's not telling anybody that he's actively, massacring people. But he wanted to be perceived as successful, and because of this, people liked him. As I stated, he got standing ovations pretty much everywhere he went. He's breaking a law that's wildly unpopular. He becomes an icon of the 20s because of this, because he's doing it in a much bigger way, and people actually really liked him, and it made it hard to prosecute him because they were afraid people would let him go anyway. So Capone made the cover of Time magazine twice, and I think this is also a really interesting critique of the case. It goes back to proxy crime. It reads, charging criminals with their true crimes makes criminal law enforcement more transparent and hence more politically accountable. Again, I think they would have liked him to have gone down for something that was related to his public crimes. They got their man, but I do think it's an interesting critique. And then this is some actual evidence. This is testimony from an individual. Basically, they're asking him, do you have any proof Capone is a murderer? And the person on the stand says, not really, just what I read in the newspapers. So again, we can see it's kind of a tumultuous case. Nobody's really able to prove anything other than the fact that he has income and he's not telling anybody about it, which is ultimately why he went to prison, but it's not the strongest case. And then this is a confidential IRS report, just basically after the trial, stating everything that they found and how it went. And you can actually go look it up. All you have to do is type in confidential IRS report, Al Capone. That's it. It's right out there for the public. 1933. So obviously it's quite old at this point. And then this is Al Capone's prison record. Like when you check into prison, they do a full workup on you. Obviously, we can see he's got the scar on his face. He's 5'11", so he probably told people he was 6 foot. But I thought it was pretty funny and pretty cool. It's right from the Cook County Jail. So this is also just online. And then the overall outcome. So obviously, I talked about this. He has $215,000 in back taxes. He gets sentenced to 11 years in prison. Again, the contempt of court charges to be served concurrently. He spent some time in Atlanta, but then went to Alcatraz, famous Alcatraz. He was actually released after serving 7 years. I don't know. Good behavior, I guess. Criminal has a heart. But basically, by the time he leaves, he's actually leaving because it's a sort of health crisis. So he actually got syphilis back in 1919 when he was working in New York. He didn't want to tell anybody because it's very embarrassing to have syphilis, but I think it's worse to be a murderer, but that's my own opinion. He never told anybody. He goes to Baltimore. He gets some brain treatment. He left it untreated, and syphilis left untreated can be very detrimental to health. He goes back to Florida, never publicly returns to Chicago, and this is where he gets the psychological workup determining that he has the mind of a 12-year-old, not the brightest, not in great health. And then in 1947, again, you can't see it here, he dies of a stroke and pneumonia in Florida with his wife and child beside him. But I also thought it was important to talk about legacy here. We're going to talk about who won the day. The government got their man, so good for them. I feel like Capone's infamy has kind of also lasted far beyond what anybody thought. So in a way, his legacy kind of won. I mean, The Untouchables won 3 Oscars. It's kind of a good, cheesy 80s movie. You should go watch it. He's also said to inspired Road to Perdition. There was a movie in 1920 that came out. It was all about him. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre, which I've touched on. Scarface. Obviously, everybody knows who that is. He was in a segment on The Godfather. There was a book that his bodyguard wrote. He was also, featured in a movie, Dillinger and Capone. Dillinger is also kind of a figure himself. And then he was on the cover of Time magazine twice. So, certainly he still has an impact to this day. Everybody knows him. And I kind of thought this quote would be a good way to end things. It's from the New York Times. It's basically just talking about why Capone is still a figure of American history. And it reads, "Why is this gangster still notorious almost a century after he fell from power? Perhaps it's because his tale reaches across our most potent national archetypes, the dauntless entrepreneur, the journey from rags to riches, the rise of the immigrant son, and the outlaw as Robin Hood." So I'll leave you with that. These are my works cited. I hope you all enjoyed and learned a little something. Thank you.